Hello, everybody. Welcome to this launch of the marvellous book by Betty McLellan, Truth Abandoned, How Can Democracies Survive? A very timely book and a feminist response. That's what Betty does very well. So first of all, just an acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways. The countries on which Spinifex offices are situated are Jiru, Bunurong, Wurundjeri, Warrawurrung, Bundungara and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. Nonie Harris is launching the book tonight. Nonie is an adjunct associate professor. Her research has focused on feminist methodologies, feminist theory and practice, work integrated learning, teaching, research and childcare policy in cross-national contexts. She was also the long-time convener of women's studies at James Cook University in Townsville, and just about everybody in Townsville knows. And so, Nonie, over to you, your go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. What a great pleasure to be here tonight. And it's my honour to be have the role of launching Betty's book. So I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the Walgarookaba and Bindal people on whose land I have the honour of addressing you from tonight. I acknowledge their elders, past and present, and I also acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. It is my honour to have been given this wonderful task of launching Dr. Betty McLellan's latest book. Whoop, there it is. Got it right somewhere there. Truth Abandoned, How Can Democracy Survive? A Feminist Response. This book will change the world. That's the title of my launch too. Betty told me this the other day, and I absolutely believe her. Such a statement may seem, in fact, wildly optimistic and a little over the top. But at the heart of what we do as radical feminists is an unshakable belief that we can, in fact, change the world. We are wildly optimistic. There is no doubt in my mind that telling the truth is fundamental to achieving this world-altering change. Betty and I discussed this book launch event. I said I was nearly done. My speech was nearly ready. Betty said she was still thinking about what she was going to say. Telling the truth is a big task. It's not easy to do, and it requires deep thought and, of course, wisdom. Optimism, wisdom, thoughtfulness, I believe, are at the heart of truth-telling. Betty asks us, if we don't know the truth, how can democracy survive? Have we abandoned the truth? Do we value it less? Have we come to a point where truth doesn't really matter? After all, don't we all have our own version of the truth? In this postmodern world, aren't we entitled to freely express our truth? Isn't that what democracy is? Who cares about what the actual truth is? In Truth Abandoned, How Can Democracy Survive? Betty challenges us to put aside our entitled individualism, to see feminists as truth tellers. Feminists tell the truth about sexual exploitation, domestic violence, discrimination, the power of language, and the very real threat of the erasure of women altogether. Feminists are uniquely positioned to tell these truths. As Betty says in her introduction, to shine a light on the path to a new relationship with truth, and in so doing, preparing the way for the ushering in of a renewed and reinvigorated democracy. When you read Truth Abandoned, you will find, like me, that many parts of this book speak to you. I liked Betty's emphasis on second wave feminist theorists because that's my real knowledge and passion in area of interest. Women like Germaine Greer, Shulamit Firestone, Betty Friedan, Bell Hooks, Dale Spender, and Anne Summers, to name a few. What a gift to be immersed in such strong feminist foundations. Foundations that were skillfully linked and connected by Betty to later feminist voices, such as Melinda Tankard-Rees, Abigail Bray, Jess Hill, and Maria Ressa. In doing so, Betty models a way forward, resisting hyper-individualism, embracing connection, valuing knowledge and community, and egalitarian approaches. The language of deception is laid bare. Betty reminds us that truth-telling can be dangerous and can come at a cost, sharing the cost of Senator Leila de Lima's truth-telling in the Philippines. Betty points to the markers of a slippery slope from democracy, the easy road to relying on the whims of a dictator. Betty alerts us to the dangers of liberalism's excesses, arguing that a focus on individualism can lead to an inability to be concerned about the needs of others. We no longer see the freedom of others as our responsibility. Avoiding the truth is central to the work of the slippery slope. These are tactics used by those in power to keep us in our place, to make sure their version of the truth is not challenged. Betty does the important work of naming these tactics, or as she says in her book, the isms. There's gradualism, where the reform process and thus justice moves painfully slowly. No radical action here. An example given is the reluctance of some political parties to institute quotas, as though lifting some will push others down. Equalism, where we fail to recognise that equality is not enough. Stoking the fear that if some get special treatment in the name of equity, then we are no longer equal. The disadvantage would be placed above the rest of us. After all, aren't we all the same? Betty argues equality does not erase discrimination. This very week, we have seen the power of equalism, I believe, as the New Zealand government seeks to wind back the benefits of the Treaty of Waitangi. A white member of the New Zealand public commented, "I don't really know what the Maori are arguing about. They seem to want more and more and more. I don't know why we should have more for one race than another. We're all New Zealanders. We should be able to work together and have equal rights." I just thought once I understood about equalism, as I could recognise the problem with that sort of comment straight away. Thank you, Betty. Then there's whataboutism, which seeks to deflect our attention away from the issue before us. Nothing but red herrings, such as aren't men victims of violence too? Don't white lives matter? Or isn't there trouble in your own backyard or glass house? And then waited outism. Let's wait until the media cycle moves on, until everyone's attention is on another issue. Wait until the public anger and outrage subsides. Nothing changes. Finally, there's hide-and-seekism, creating walls of silence and secrecy. Transparency, a democracy essential, is devalued. Bureaucratic gatekeeping delayed FOI responses, obfuscation, and holding back. These are the tactics that Betty explores. As you can see from my brief summary of some of the content of Betty's book, Betty is urging us to see ourselves as serious thinkers. But above all, Betty is saying, don't panic. Change is possible. In the final stages of our book, Betty argues that democracy calls for acceptance based on truth. It is important for us to work together as allies to put aside these false narratives, changing them to something better, more positive, across all areas, locally and globally. New narratives anchored in truth-telling. Truth Abandoned, How Can Democracy Survive? A Feminist Response is an important book at a pivotal moment in history. Democracy is on shaky ground. Our collective breath is held. I can't recommend Betty's book highly enough. It took courage, brilliance, and wisdom to write this book. Let's value it. I urge you to buy not only a copy for yourself, but also for your friends and family. I know that I'm sending a few off to my family for Christmas. In the coming weeks, months, and maybe years, I think Betty's book will be an anchor point, a constant reminder that truth matters and a better world is on its way. Congratulations, Betty.
Thank you, Nonie. Thank you very much. Now, how to introduce Betty? Well, I will use her book as the basis of my intro, but I've known Betty for many years now. In fact, so many I can't actually remember. And she's also almost the next door neighbour, because she's only a 3-hour drive away from us. And up here, that's pretty close. So the more formal part, Betty McLellan is a feminist ethicist and psychotherapist and the author of the best-selling feminist self-help book, Help, I'm Living with a Man Crossed Out Boy, which has been translated into 16 languages. She is also the author of Overcoming Anxiety, Beyond Psychopression, and Hannah, My Unremarkable Grandmother, and Unspeakable, A Feminist Ethic of Speech. So this is her 6th book. With a focus on both the personal and political, Betty successfully combines her work as a psychotherapist and a broader emphasis on feminist ethical analysis and activism. And she lives in Townsville in North Queensland. And I might just add one more thing. This would be a marvellous book for being on courses because it is so clear. One of the clearest written books that I've ever come across. So, Betty, your turn now. Over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. It's very nice to have such a good and clear introduction. And Nonie, thank you for your careful treatment of my book. I must say that we should have compared notes, because as you were talking, I thought, oh no, that's what I'm going to say. so we'll see. I will repeat some of it, but thank you very much, Nonie. It was so good. And look, thank you all for coming. This is just a wonderful thing for me to have so many people here on this online book launch, really to help me celebrate the launch of this book. And, you know, looking at the title of the book, I know we've said the title many times, but let me say it one more time. Truth Abandoned, How Can Democracy Survive? And given the results of the United States election, one would think that I have perfect timing. This certainly is a time when many of us are concerned about the survival of democracy. The thing is, though, that I started thinking, researching, writing down my initial thoughts for this book in 2019. Now, cast your mind back to that time, if you will, when Donald Trump was President of the United States, Boris Johnson was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Scott Morrison was Prime Minister of Australia. And you'll have some idea why I felt compelled to write this book. Truth was abandoned so often by all three leaders. Someone tallied up the lies told by Donald Trump during his first presidency, tens of thousands of them. And this was back then. By now, of course, there'd be so many more. Similarly, in Britain, someone tallied up the lies told by Boris Johnson. And I have links to both of those in the chapter titled Lies, Damned Lies, and the Death of Democracy. And in Australia, too, the independent newspaper Crikey did the same thing about Scott Morrison's lies, a dossier of lies and falsehoods, they called it. Now, of course, we've had it confirmed in recent weeks that the majority of Americans aren't concerned about Donald Trump's lies. Truth doesn't matter. Indeed, the rise of the extreme right in many Western countries demonstrates the fact that many people no longer see truth as an imperative. Truth can be whatever Donald Trump says it is, whatever billionaires say it is, whatever business leaders say it is, whatever politicians say it is, whatever misogynists like Andrew Tate or Nick Fuentes say it is. Did you know that far-right pro-Nazi internet troll Nick Fuentes, who coined the phrase, "your body, my choice," was a dinner guest of Donald Trump on election night? Well, of course. Now look, how naive were we feminists to think that the feminist movement we pass on to the next generation had made some significant progress? Of course it had, but here we are, back at square one. But this is not a time for depression, not a time for giving up the fight. It is simply a time to pause, reflect, re-energize, and get to work developing new strategies. Now, to my book, because that's what we're here for. There are two things I do in this book. One is I sound the alarm and make a case for the fact that without truth, there can be no democracy. And the other thing I do is I ask the question, how can feminism respond to the dire situation we have today? Now, I would like to take you on a quick trip through the chapters so you get a clear picture of how I deal with those 2 points. Chapters 1 and 2, I focus on radical feminists' insistence on speaking truth to power. Chapter 1, as Nonie mentioned, it's a bit like a literature review, showing how radical feminists have always written about and protested about difficult but critical issues. Never satisfied with a superficial treatment of any issue affecting women, radical feminists insist on digging deep and getting to root causes, which of course is what the word radical means. Chapter 2 then brings the literature review up to the present and tells the stories of women like Brittany Higgins, Grace Tame, the Me Too movement, and so on. Women courageously speaking truth to power, as they were doing at the time I was writing those initial chapters. Then chapter 3, as I've mentioned, Lies, Damned Lies, and the Death of Democracy. After looking at the fracturing of democracy under headings like ingrained inequalities, tribalism, political extremism, the unwillingness to compromise, I then asked, how has it come to this? And I then discussed neoliberalism, postmodernism, liberalism, and libertarianism. And I say, all of these seem to me to have had some influence on why it has come to this. Now, chapter 4, which is the one that Nonie spelled out and which I am also going to spell out, I'd like to spend a few moments taking you through chapter 4 because from feedback I've received already, this seems to be the chapter that's getting the most attention. I've called it Creative Ways of Avoiding the Truth. Now, my aim here is to demonstrate the fact that even though a person might not lie outright, to avoid the truth when truth-telling and action are required is in itself a falsity. I've written about this. I had quite a bit of fun really thinking about this. I've written about this in terms of isms, like systems of belief. And I made up some of the words. The first one, gradualism, which of course is not a made-up word, but I've chosen that because the tactic often used by governments and political parties to avoid taking radical action is to take that really gradual path. It enables them to make a show of acting on important issues while nothing really changes. Black deaths in custody is an important, if tragic, example. Oh, yes, we're going to address this problem, say successive governments. Lots of inquiries, even a royal commission. So why is it that today there are just as many Indigenous people dying in police custody as there were decades ago? I think it's an avoidance, an unwillingness on the part of governments to face the whole truth about Australia's white male systems. Another issue which is close to our hearts, of course, women being killed by their male partners or ex-partners. Again, the statistics never change, except this year, the numbers have so far exceeded those of other years. Governments are throwing millions of dollars at this issue to ensure women are supported. And domestic violence services, women's centres, women's legal services, and women's shelters do an amazing job. But I want to see governments stop avoiding the real issue and ask the question, why do men do this? Why do so many men seemingly have an underlying hatred of women? Look, I know it's not easy for governments, but I do think truth is not served by avoidance of the root causes of things, or by half-truths or deceit. But this is just an aside, but when I think about gradualism does seem to be the order of the day, unless it's the trans lobby demanding the right to change sex on their birth certificates or demanding language change. As we've seen on that issue, governments have been able to find the energy to effect radical change almost immediately. Go figure. Well, the second one, as Nonie mentioned, is equalism. This is the second ism. And, we hear all the time, we hear men's rights people saying women are just as violent as men, even though the statistics prove otherwise. But that's what many people want to believe. Many people want to believe that we're equal, that one sex is not any worse than the other. They really want to believe that. And also when Black Lives Matter marches were on, we heard white lives matter too, as if we even had to say that. Or the voice referendum, probably the argument that won many people over to the no side was their belief in equalism. If Indigenous people get a special voice in the Constitution, that will create an unequal society, as Nonie said, they're saying in New Zealand right now. No interest in equity, only interested in the appearance of equality. Okay, well, then I talk about whataboutism, and you know about whataboutism because it's been we've been hearing about whataboutism for a long time. But it's the classic red herring. Put the focus on something else as a way of avoiding the truth about the issue at hand. Then this one I made up that I thought, oh, this is very clever of me to do this. Wait it out-ism. You know, it's like, it's particularly relevant to governance. And I wrote that particularly after the Black Lives Matter and the March for Justice for Women marches that lots of us were involved in here in Australia. The government's response at that time was so familiar. Lots of citizens rally and march, lots of passion, lots of noise. The media was right in there reporting and commenting on it all. Some politicians joined in the protests. All were seeming to agree that something had to be done, but not just yet. If they could just wait it out. In a couple of days, the media will have moved on to something else. The pressure would be off, and then no need for governments to do anything. The status quo will be restored. And that is what happens. We see it happening time and again. And then the last one, I do want to say something about hide and seek-ism. This deals with another falsity that exists in our democracy, especially here in Australia. Australia has had a freedom of information policy whereby all citizens are able to seek information about lobbyists who have the ear of government, about anything we might want to know, because we're a democracy and we're supposed to be allowed to know. But it seems that while our job, citizens' job, is to seek information, the job of freedom of information public servants is very often to hide that information. So you will get a response to your request, but it may come to you with every important detail redacted, which of course makes a mockery of the original intention of the FOI legislation. So all of these are creative ways of avoiding the truth. Now, just very briefly, I'm going to say something about the last two chapters. Chapter 5 is a fairly substantial chapter where I discuss individualism, populism, and identity politics. And I hope you'll find that interesting and thought-provoking. In light of the American elections, there's something I would add to the section on populism. In the book, I discuss populism as a response to powerlessness, populism as a response to contempt, and populism as a response to humiliation, which these experiences are what so many people have in their lives. And I did that after a lot of research and reading of the theories of reputable political and social analysts. And I stand by what I've written. But today, I think I would also explore the revenge element in populism. Populism as a movement is focused on revenge. But that's for another day. That's for someone else to write that book. That's a sequel. For some of you who are younger, to write that. All right. In the final chapter, chapter 6, I discuss in a positive way the role feminists have in shining a light on the path ahead. I make practical suggestions. For example, we have to work to change the narratives that influence people's thoughts and behaviour every day. Also, another one is we have to work together with like-minded others. Instead of being in our own feminist enclave, work together with like-minded others. We don't always have to agree on everything, but work together on the things we do agree on. That's the kind of thing I say in the final chapter. So I say to myself and to you through this chapter, we must not give up in the face of all the pain and ugliness and weirdness we see all around us. And of course, since the US elections, things have become even uglier and much more scary for women, which simply means that for us feminist activists, our task of making the world a better place has just got tougher. But we're up for it. We will continue to be truth seekers and truth tellers, because we know that the world needs us and our commitment to truth more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Betty, and thank you, Nonie, also, because the two talks together really expand on what's in the book, and it's a fabulous book. So now, if any of you has a question or comment that you want to make, keep it short, so other people have a chance as well. So you can either write it in the chat, or you can raise that hand down at the bit where it says react, and you just open that up and you can see where it says raise hand at the bottom. There we go. Make sure you're unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Two things that are happening at the moment that really disturb me is in this area. One is the concept of misinformation and the actions of government to control misinformation. And allied to that, there's a concept of blocking what is so-called media, social media access, which includes, I believe, the blocking of YouTube, so that you end up with the under 16-year-olds having a very restricted access. If they do access, they're likely to do it illegally, and because of that, more likely to slip into something like the dark web. So there's two questions in that.
Is that for me to answer, Susan?
Yeah, that's for you to answer, Betty.
Well, I mean, I think we agree, don't we, that there's misinformation and disinformation. And if only there was something that could be done about that, then we wouldn't need to change, we wouldn't need to block access of teenagers, would we? I mean, it's because of all the lies, the misinformation, disinformation that they're being fed all the time, that my feeling, Celia, is that something has to be done. I don't know what else to say about that, but because I mean it is also true that it's difficult when the government tries to do this, because we know that it's fairly easy for teenagers to have access to whatever they want through someone else, through their parents, through anyone else. So, but I don't know. Would anyone else like to help with this question?
Kathy Chambers has just made a note in the chat, say it's just been announced on the ABC that YouTube has not been blocked. So, Spider, do you want to say something?
Listening this evening, I just had this thought that all of these isms that Betty was mentioning have arisen in desperation to undo what feminism did.
Yes.
What is the core? They've done two things. They've destroyed truth and they've destroyed the word woman. And so that's all of this is in response to them understanding that when women stood up, empowered in truth and speaking the truth, they had to take that away.
Yes.
This is their response.
Yes, and we certainly see that, don't we, after the American election, like women, like it seems to me that men now are not afraid at all to say anything derogatory about women. It's almost like they've been empowered, and the whole thing is a reaction. I mean, a lot of it is a reaction to the feminist movement, I think.
I'm here at the camp out live-in blockade of Newcastle Coalport for the weekend, and this 22-year-old young woman who's been part of this for 12 years has won in the Supreme Court against the police and the government. They tried to take an exclusion to say you can't go on the beach, you can't go in the water, and this young woman has stood up in the Supreme Court. She's 22 years old, and she also, you know, like we had an effect on the wider world, but we also had this extraordinary effect on the generations behind us. And I see this and the way they're organising the camp, and it's absolutely fantastic. And it goes back to Greenham Common and Women's Pine Gap and Coburn Sound. And so always there's a reverberation where what seems to be incomprehensibly horrible has also, these beautiful things have grown.
Kathy Chambers has also, I know Janet has just noted, the Supreme Court ruling is so good, the Newcastle Herald shows the people who are there. Sandy, you want to say something? Sandy Jeffs.
Hello, Sue. Thanks, Betty. I was just wondering, do you think that identity politics is a form of narcissism which has infected our society, that people's conception of themselves and their identity is so paramount and so important that anything collective is now lost, the idea of collectivism is lost, and that the focus on your personal identity has taken you away from the collective and is a form of narcissism? Just wondering what you think.
Yes, but I mean, what we do know is that the focus on the individual now is just so overpowering, isn't it? Like, nobody seems to feel that they have to think about the collective, to be concerned about that. And socialism is a dirty word, and you know, it's like it's all about me. It's really, it's something from which I'm not sure I know how Western society is going to recover from this.
Well, I mean, individualism is such an issue these days, and I also think that goes back to your discussion of libertarianism and the way that, you know, that's played out, and it's libertarianism is not seen as being particularly bad, even though it's a me, no government approach. So yeah, there are a lot of, and that certainly comes out in the trans movement, or rather the trans individuals, because that's what they are.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Betty, too, that one of the problems is the focus that developed on rights. And, you know, I always think there's a real problem with the rights analysis because it doesn't take into account responsibility. So, you know, we saw, for example, the growth of student rights in university system, which, you know, there's a need for it, but on the other hand, there was no responsibility that they might have either. So, you know, and it ties into the libertarian idea too, that the individual is paramount. But, you know, we can't have rights that we never seem to be able to have rights that don't impinge on somebody else. So I think what's happened in a lot of ways is a lack of relationship between people, or lack of relationship between ideas even. So that, you know, everybody seems focused in tunnel vision in the way we used to critique the medical profession. You know, everything is about tunnel vision instead of looking outwards at the relationship between things and between people. And, you know, when you were saying why is it that men keep killing women, you know, for example, I mean, this is a really complex question that I cannot for the life of me come up with an answer to. And it's, you know, I just don't get the idea at all. But I think you're really right that what's happening with America, for example, is that because you have leadership, there's a lot of world leaders that are men, and their form of leadership has become more and more bogged down in the idea of the masculine male strong man.
Yes.
And it sort of enables prejudice, it enables sexism, it enables racism to come up as a legitimate way of being.
Yes. Yes, almost to be praised, this is something to aim for.
To aim for, yeah.
And you think, well, how could the work we've been doing have fallen on deaf ears so much? You know,
Well, I don't think it did in many ways. I mean, you know, we have rape crisis centres, we have domestic violence assistance, we have a lot going on. It's very easy to forget that we do actually have support. But I think there's always, you know, Renata and I used to talk about this, our sense of disillusion. And I always felt that with the women's movement, it was, you can't expect in your lifetime for everything to have been sorted and changed, but it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And we'll always have that because we're always going to be in that battle. I mean, I can't imagine a world in which all men are not doing the things that some men are doing now. So I guess we need to talk about where you go next. You know, this is, again, the idea of critique, but what is the step forward? What is the action forward towards change?
yeah, well, yes, and how do we change the emphasis in society from the individual rights to responsibility, as you were saying in the beginning, responsibility for the whole? How do we do that? And, you know, I see that this whole thing about identity politics is a real worry to me. Some of us, say in the women's movement originally, like that was identity politics. We were talking about the identity of women.
Mm.
But we didn't, it seems to me that women, feminists didn't turn it into an individualism, like we knew always that we had a responsibility to others. I don't know how we can get the conversation now in society. Like this is what I said, we need to change the narratives in society. That, as I said in my final chapter, we need to somehow figure out a way to get people talking again about others. But isn't it interesting? I always think about this. When there's a disaster like bushfires or terrible floods, people come rushing in, and there's a real sense of they're going to help, and they do help. It's very good. But as soon as the disaster's over, it's back to me again. I don't know how we can change. Maybe someone can.
You know, I think when I was younger, we had to fight for everything.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, I know now when I'm talking young people in their 30s who say to me, you had it so easy. You had it so easy. And I don't know where that's come from. This is the thing that we have ruined the world, you know, and we had it so easy. And in many ways, kind of we did. And, you know, we could break things, like we could break what my mother had to put up with, for example.
Yes.
So, but because we were united in our desire for breaking. You know, we broke the family apart, we broke religion apart, we broke politics apart. We actually changed a lot of things. So part of the problem now is it that young women, for example, don't see they need to change anything?
I think that might be right. I wish I could hear from someone else too about that, because
sorry.
Might be, no, this is good. It's a good question. Or maybe they don't need to change things as we needed to change them, because some of them are trying to change, say, climate change, that sort of, those kinds of issues. But yes, they look at us and they think we had it easy, and we look at them and say, well, look at how we've changed. Our work has helped to change a lot of things so that it's easier for you. But I guess the truth is it's difficult for women in every generation.
And you know, the other problem is that a lot of what we say is just simply irrelevant to so many others. And
irrelevant to who?
Irrelevant. It's like it doesn't even go past them or go into their brains. So, you know, like what women think is, it doesn't carry any weight. But Renata.
What I was going to say, we had, Susan and I had the discussion of Summer Brodrick's book, Nothing Matters, on the women's WDI in England. And we, at the end, we talked about that today. Where is there a radical feminist who is a professor at some university? I cannot actually think of anybody. And that means that it's like, for instance, Summer did her book as a PhD. And like when Robin and I were there, Sheila was there. There were some in Jan Raymond, obviously, in the US, and Phyllis Chesler and others. We did actually have the possibility to have our students think about topics that were really, and write about topics that had the possibility to bring about change. Nowadays, if they're not into, postmodernist theories and language that nobody understands, there is no possibility that they even get there and can even start a PhD and publish papers. And I think that is a really, really important argument to make, because, we say young women have to speak up again, but young women have to educate themselves, because they can't get this education anymore at any kind of university. So they have to do it themselves, or maybe as a way forward, what would be brilliant is if some young women would start what we had as consciousness raising groups. And in these consciousness raising groups, they might want to call it something different, don't want to go back to the old mothers, things. They could discuss books and talk about these ideas. And your book, of course, Betty, would not be really a prime example to discuss, because you have to, somehow or other, you have to start thinking about the ideas you want to put forward to the future. And of course, it's one thing to say, climate change has to stop, and we have to stop the water getting warmer, etc., etc. But you still need to have the foundation to discuss this area, let alone things about violence against women, why men continue to harm and kill women. So I don't know. I think, where are the women, the young women today, getting their education? It's a really, really, really big problem. Yeah. And where can we maybe step into and help by setting up something, except, of course, they have to do it. If we old, farts, so to speak, set up a consciousness raising group, who's going to come? Us and nobody else. Which would be very enjoyable, but it's not the point of the matter, really. So that I think really concerns absence of radical feminists at any kind of institutions of higher learning.
Bronwyn is not there anymore,
We
you
have a
know?
A couple of other
couple of
people
things.
have their hand up now too.
Sandy
and
has in the chat. Did we feminists unleash a monster when we said the personal is political? I think the problem is the political is just not, I mean, nobody thinks about the consequences, you know, politics and personal and stuff. But Bronwyn has her hand up, and generally we try to keep these launches to an hour, and Renata has to do some thank yous. So Bronwyn, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, yeah, I did. Thanks. Oh, I just put my video on. It's gone off again. Here I am. Okay. I want to push back a little bit about the young women thing. I'm getting a little bit tired of hearing this. I'm actually getting into contact with a number of young women through opposition to transgender politics, through lesbian-only politics. I know the Lesbian Club has attracted there's a very dynamic young woman who's also joined Australian Feminist for Women's Rights, who looks after a young lesbians group in the Lesbian Club, and she wants to start up a young women's group because there are straight women having these issues too, in relation to a forward. So, we have meetings in Sydney at the Women's Library, and there are women in their 20s that come along, and they have really strong feminist politics. So I really, and, you know, Spider was talking a little while ago about the environmental activist who's using techniques that women pioneered at Greenham and so on. So I think things are difficult for every generation. It's differently difficult for this generation. Yeah, young women, particularly young women who don't gender conform, they're all sort of having to go through, you know, this thing about, oh, am I really trans? And they, you know, they have this sort of individualist ideology pushed down their throat. We didn't deal with social media when we were young. You know, we did everything on Romeo Gestetner handouts and telephone trees, right? We didn't have social media. We didn't have the internet. So there are different sorts of onslaughts of information and disinformation that young women are getting now. So I think, you know, we are a little bit quick to say, oh, well, young women aren't doing things, but young women are doing things. They're just doing things differently and in a different context. And I think it's a little bit unfair. I mean, I'm not saying that anybody's being judgmental, but I hear this lament quite frequently, where are the young women? But I think we forget that radical feminism was always a minority movement. We were never a mass movement. There may have been mass movements around things like abortion rights and so on, but radical feminism, we've always been a marginal minority. And, you know, and I don't see anything particularly to celebrate in that. I don't want to sort of, you know, do this splendid isolation thing, because I agree with Betty that we need to try to make connections with people who agree with us on some things. I mean, how far are we prepared to compromise? You know, like I'm not necessarily going to sort of foxtrot with Pauline Hanson anytime soon. But you know, there are conversations that we can have, because if we only talk in an echo chamber, we're never going to get anywhere. So, you know, but radical feminists have always tried to talk to people who disagree with us as well. But I just wanted to say, like, you know, give young women a break. You know, they're doing things in their way, and they will do things in their way, and that's up to them. And they're facing completely different challenges. They're facing economic challenges that, you know, most of us did not face. And, you know, so they're facing all sorts of other sorts of emergencies, including the erosion of democracy that we did not face in quite the same way. A lot of us were around in the heady 60s and 70s, and there were different possibilities then. So I think they're doing it really tough, and a lot of them are doing some very creative things. That's all.
Bronwyn, I think I really agree with what you said, but what about my question about education? Where are these young women who are doing things getting their education from? Do you have any ideas how, you know, they might get more education?
Okay, very quickly, because I don't want to sort of like hog the floor here, but I am still a radical feminist professor. I just don't work in gender studies. We need to know that women's studies in Australia, apart from Deakin, which was an exception rather than the rule, and thanks Robin and Renata and other women who worked there, but, you know, apart from that enclave, and apart from individuals like Sheila or myself or others who worked in different departments, radical feminism has always been marginal in women's studies too. Women's studies departments were set up by socialist feminists and liberal feminists and so on. Certainly that was the case at Sydney. So, you know, we like to sort of maybe think of our past with slightly rose-tinted glasses. I think there was a headiness about the political movements of the 70s that gave opportunities, but they very, very quickly got co-opted, and were sometimes the women who already co-opted moved into those institutional spaces. So I think in terms of the university, feminism has always had an uphill battle. And I don't think that's necessarily changed a great deal. I think ideologically there's a big capture now of universities in aggressive ways, because we know that as soon as feminism makes any inroads anywhere in any liberal society, the way they kill it off is to co-opt us. Divide and conquer and co-opt. That's the way they do it. I could have done divide and conquerism for Betty's book, yeah? Co-optationism, yeah? That's the way they do it. That's the way they silence and marginalize it. It was the case in the 70s, it's the case now. That's all.
We need to end the recording soon. So Renata, if we could do our thanks, and then we'll stop the recording. And if there's urgent discussion still to have, we can continue after the recording's turned off.
Okay, well, I'll try to be relatively brief. Just my very, very big thank yous, obviously, to Betty for writing this really very marvelous book, and very well founded and very well written. And as Susan said earlier, very clear. And I really hope it goes to faraway places and gets read, including by young women. Secondly, my big thanks also to Nonie for her very insightful launch speech. And it's great to see you here, Nonie, and I know how much you have done for women's studies at James Cook University. Then, as I usually say, and it's absolutely true, a book doesn't just make it by themselves. So when Betty gave us the manuscript, there were Pauline, what is the matter with me today? Pauline Hopkins, Susan and me, who were over it, like crabs, and found things to comment and to criticize and whatever. So a book needs edited, and we are very, very, it's very wonderful to have Pauline on our team. So that's Pauline Hopkins. Then Caitlin Roper, who is in Western Australia, puts our wares on Instagram and X and Facebook, and talks about reviews, etc. So many thanks, Caitlin. Rachel, who you have just met, then does wonderful newsletters, is our tech guru, and holds Spinifex together in many ways, including the website. Danielle, who's in Geelong, is the office manager, sends the books out, is also doing an absolutely fabulous job, and is very involved in making everything better, the systems better, the website better, so that you get your books, quicker once you order them. So all of them, big, big thanks. But not to forget Deb Snipson, who has done another really striking, strong cover for Betty's book. And Helen, who does the interiors, our typesetter, and it's beautifully set out. And last, but of course not least, our boss, Susan Osborne, who bosses us all around, sometimes very nicely, sometimes not so. And without her, nothing would not happen. And me too, that's true. We're a good pair. So I think
reference queen.
Well, yes, somebody has to. So anyway, I think I have done the very basic thanks, and thank you, of course, to everybody who came to the launch. I really do hope you spread the news about this book. This is our last launch for 2024. We will start 2025 with a mega launch for Men Against Being by Aurora Linnea. It was published this month, but we just couldn't get it in. But Susan and I will discuss Men Against Being on WDI Feminist Question Time on the 15th of December. So prepare yourself for a feast of big ideas there. So I wish you a very happy Feminismus. Get some well-earned rest. And may 25 be a good year for radical feminists.